All right, welcome. So welcome back to our second session of the day. We're going to have a panel now of speakers speaking a bit more practically about crises having to do with community, but building directly on the sorts of themes that we talked about last session. So we have three speakers on this panel. First of all, Charles Moore, who is a member of the Bruderhof Community and is a pastor and editor and author for Plough Publishing. And he'll be speaking to us on how our communities are in crisis because we individuals are in crisis, particularly issues having to do with loneliness and alienation. And then second, we'll hear from Maria Fedoryka, who's professor of philosophy at Ave Maria University in Florida. And she's written widely on Dietrich von Hildebrand and on personalist philosophy. And she'll be speaking on the foundational role of the relationship between child and parents. And then, last but not least, we'll hear from Derek Jeffries, who's professor of humanities, religion, and philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, and who volunteers and lectures widely in prisons and jails, speaking on the experience of madness in connection to his relationships in prisons and jails. So let's welcome our speakers. Charles.
Okay. Well, it's good to be here. And I was very stimulated by your talk, Mark. And as I mentioned to you, that has helped me to cut my comments down in half. So I want to begin by quoting from Howard Snyder, who was a Methodist theologian 40 years ago. He asked the question, how would you go about destroying community? He said, follow the following strategies. Fragment family life, move people away from the neighborhoods where they grew up, set people farther apart by giving them bigger houses and bigger yards, and separate the places people work from where they live. In other words, quote, partition off people's lives into as many worlds as possible. Facilitate the process, get everyone their own car, replace meaningful communication with television. I'm sure he would add social media today. Keep them busy with too many options and diversions. And finally, cut down on family size and fill people's homes with things. The result? A post-familial, disconnected culture where self is king, relationships are thin, and individuals are, quote, free to fend for themselves. Since then, things have only gotten worse, compounded by the advancement of technology, digital technology in particular. As Sherry Turtle observes in her book, Alone Together, the web's promise and the social media's carrot of bottomless abundance is leaving millions inwardly and relationally famished. We now live in a culture of simulation, where real, tactile, face-to-face relationships of loyalty and intimacy are all but a memory. We are free, but our relationships are shallow and fleeting. We can communicate with each other no matter where we are in an instant, but we don't know how to commune with those right next to us. We no longer are able to give our full attention. No wonder we are lonely. And if, as Snyder observes, our social lives are now structured to keep us apart, we have a problem that is deeper than loneliness, and as Mark mentioned, that problem is alienation. Our life now, the way in which we live, is a logical end, the logical end of modernity's highest ideal, the triumph of the free, autonomous self. That ideal rests on two fundamental axiomatic imperatives in my mind that destroy community. And the first, which I will not go into detail now because Mark so ably described for us today, but the first imperative is exalt the individual. And I think what we have today is the ideology of expressive individualism. It's a very particular kind of individualism that goes beyond just the fact that we are separate now from one another. So we are fundamentally, in this view, discrete, autonomous, self-reliant, self-contained selves. Our identities are ultimately constituted atomistically, apart from our families, countries, faith communities, classes, ethnicities, sexes, vocations, or other places in the flow of history. We are fundamentally ahistorical because we have become atomized and separated from that which actually makes us human. And so now we are free to define our own concept of existence, our own concepts of meaning, happiness, the mystery of life. As long as we are constrained, we are not free, and as long as we are not free, we cannot be true selves under this ideology. So according to expressive individualism, society and tradition are inherently alienating and repressive because it forces us to conform and to assume roles we have not chosen for ourselves. We not only possess our own body, we can construct our own bodies. We have a right to not only control our own body, but we have a right to possess and control the things we cultivate with our bodies. Part of what we cultivate with our own bodies is our own identities. And so we have a right to construct our own identities. We are free, absolutely free, autonomous selves. We not only have a right to cultivate and construct our own identities, but an obligation to do so, to be anything we want to be or are capable of being. The more possibilities we have for expressing ourselves, the better and happier we all are. Of course, in this construal, freedom is the highest value. And because freedom is the highest value, our identities are intrinsically fluid. The only thing that is solid is choice. Love in this kind of approach to looking at the world is finally understood as whatever maximizes the freedom of individuals to act and identify however they choose for themselves. Yes, we can socially contract with one another, but we do that because we think that this will ultimately maximize our own interest and freedom. Community is an instrumental good only. Other people are ultimately a means to our end, as Mark so ably described. We are expendable and replaceable. I can't help but think of Kevin O'Leary, host of the popular TV show Shark Tank. Once he gave the following advice to a young man whose fiancée had recently told him that he had to choose between running his business and their relationship. Quote, "Let's be pragmatic," he said. "Which is easier to replace, your business or your fiancé?" The maximized self is not just a free self, but a self that acts. We are fundamentally actors. We are most fulfilled when we can exercise and maximize our own power, including our power to overcome whatever stands over and against us. And hence our obsession with technology, our obsession with power, and our obsession with our own freedom. Exalt the self, and secondly, serve the marketplace. This is the second imperative of a hyper-expressive individualism. Why? Because wealth maximizes freedom. Money is power. Wealth is the soil in which the free self can flourish. Not community, but wealth. It's what makes the autonomous self possible. It not only gives us the ability to satiate our wants, but gives us power to exercise our wills. Now, since freedom is the greatest good, wealth ends up being the value which we must pursue to protect all other values, ultimately ourselves. And since wealth is produced in the context of the marketplace, we are to give ourselves to the marketplace. And how much of our lives are spent being determined and dictated by the marketplace. The marketplace now is our new home. That is our community, the workplace, and the dictates of the workplace. It is no longer a distinct arena where goods are valued and exchanged. It is, according to Rodney Clapp, the basis for all life. Competition, not community, is not only normative and legitimate in every sphere of life, it is expected, and we presume we are wired for it. So where does this leave us? I want to talk about several cultural corrosives. A cultural corrosive is a subconscious, embedded, self-defeating attitude, outlook, and set of behaviors we deem to be givens in order to achieve and live the good life. What are these cultural corrosives? Briefly, compartmentalization or compartmentalism. Specialization is essential for efficiency. Efficiency is essential for the marketplace. Life is therefore split apart, fundamentally fragmentary. Home life, family, our personal life, social life, church, voluntary organizations, recreational life, whatever you want to call, they're distinct and separate. They may intersect, but they're never woven into a fabric. So life becomes incohesive, contradictory, confusing, and in the end, stressful. We are an anxious generation for a reason. With a fluid self, free from all that would help to cohere life, we are now afloat and intrinsically anxious. So in addition to compartmentalism, I want to refer to another cultural corrosive as selfism. And this is a matrix of chronic self-destructive messaging centered around oneself. You're on your own. If you don't look out for yourself, no one else will. Watch out. Everyone has an agenda. Don't depend on anyone. Use or be used. Keep your guard up, or else you'll be taken advantage of. Keep your image up, your options open. Don't miss out, or you will be left behind. Don't interfere. It's not worth it. Avoid conflict at all costs. Don't let anyone tell you who you are or what to do. If life's not going well, something is to blame. Take care of yourself. Only then will you be able to take care of others. You deserve the best, nothing less. Happiness is getting what you want. Don't commit. Relationships don't last anyway. Don't owe nobody anything. The last cultural corrosive I would like to highlight is commodificationism. All of life becomes a commodity, including community. Community is something we can choose to have if we want to. You can shop for it, and when necessary, upgrade or improve it with something new or better. The value of community is ultimately determined with reference to yourself. Community in this sense is simply the feeling of togetherness. Since everything is a means to an end, there must be something unique about community, and it's a subjective feeling of togetherness. And that subjective feeling depends on how well you feel accepted and appreciated. Community, therefore, is inherently thinned, since we've outsourced all of life because we can pay for our basic human services. It's never sustainable, and it's invariably tribalistic. A community becomes an enlargement and extension of oneself. You end up in community with those that are like you. So, one last thing about the commodification of community. Finding community is a math problem in this situation. It's a possibility that is determined by whether you have the time for it and can afford it. Does your schedule allow it? So the fallout, and I will conclude with this. I want to read from a Substack column called Girls by Ria India. Just posted last month. Look, she's referring to Gen Z, her own generation. Our mental health is collapsing. Self-harm and suicide rates are still on the rise. We feel lonelier than ever. We feel hopeless about the future. Despite the wellness industry being worth trillions, despite the constant mental health campaigns, despite the relentless raising of awareness, none of it makes a dent. Let's face it, what we in our generation are missing is a sense of stability, of being part of something bigger, something more enduring, something beyond ourselves. No wonder we are desperate for that deeper connection. We are all clawing for something, anything that is permanent, that isn't commodified and cheap and ephemeral, something that lasts. Our entire lives are just a collection of things and events that crumble and disappear at any moment. We keep our options open, our long-term relationships fall apart the second someone loses feelings. Even if we do get deeper commitment, it's all a big joke. Marriage vows are funny. The ceremony, a perfect moment for a prank. Divorce, a celebration. Meanwhile, we estrange ourselves from our families. We try out different places and try on different identities. And if we take the message of our therapeutic culture seriously enough, we are in danger of ending up a well-adjusted person, not dependent on anyone, nobody reliant on us, with nothing to lose. We are free. What is plaguing us today is the transience of everything. Everything is uprooted, everything is unstable. We don't feel attached to anything, anyone, anywhere. We don't even feel like the earth will stick around. Nothing in our lives sticks around. Our parents can't even hold it together, and for some reason we think we have become more free. Oh, travel more, hook up more, invest less, because that's how you invest less, that's how you get hurt. But isn't that the problem? We are looking for something more than this life where people have so few loyalties to each other, where everything is impermanent, where we can't feel rooted anywhere. Relationships, we have lost the basic requirement, faithfulness, the absolute bare minimum. No, I don't want my relationships like this. I don't want to treat marriage like an employment contract. I want to be bound. I want to be bound more, bound to people, bound to places, bound to the good, bound to right and wrong, bound to something other than myself. That's why our communities are in crisis.
Thank you, Charles, for that wonderful presentation. I'm going to look at another aspect of why communities are in crisis. But Charles, I think what you presented is a very important supplement, because there are internal factors, which is what I'm going to talk about right now. And Charles was giving us many external factors, and I think they go together very well. So what I would like to talk about is community now in the broad sense. It's going to be about relationship. It's going to be about one particular relationship, which is the relationship between the parent and the child. And the reason I like to do this is because I think that this relationship is the one that's going to be the foundation for all other relationships and also for communities in the more narrow sense. So what Dr. Spencer told us about the need to approach the other person as one who is precious and valuable in and of themselves, I think is something that becomes possible only if each of us first have a self, are a self, and possess ourselves. But paradoxically, we emerge into existence already in relationship. So there's a little bit of a paradox here. Dietrich von Hildebrand speaks of relationship as being something which consists in the interpenetration of looks. There's a mutuality there. There's a giving and a receiving. I'd like to suggest that there's another context for relationship which actually isn't mutual in that way, but which I think is truly a relationship in some sense. There's really receiving on the other end, but there's not a mutuality. And so I would like to explore that a little bit, and that's going to be the foundation for our ability then to enter into relationships which really are mutual and which form the basis for material communities and the kind of thing that Charles was talking about. Okay, so I would like to start by quoting Joseph Pieper. He speaks of love as the word of love as being, it's to say to another, it's good that you exist. I rejoice in your existence. So it's not just good objectively, but it causes me to rejoice. And through rejoicing in the existence of another, in some sense, I allow the other person to experience their own selfhood and their own preciousness. And he says the primal act of creation, of God's creation, is that he loves the person into existence. In some sense, he says, it is good that you exist, and in that movement we come into existence. So what I would like to look at, though, is very interestingly, in the case of angels, the angels come to be directly by the act of God and all at once. There's no process of graduality, of coming into existence stepwise, so to speak. So what God does is he creates us, in a sense, inchoate, so in seed, as it were, and then he withdraws. And you could say he hands the baton on to other finite agents to continue the act of creation. I'd like to read a quote from Joseph Pieper. His wonderful essay called Love is partially the inspiration, is a springboard for these reflections. He says the following. He says, all human love is an echo of God's love. But if all goes well, and if all goes happily as it should, then in human love something more takes place than mere echo, mere repetition, and imitation. What takes place is a continuation, and in a certain sense, even a perfecting of what was begun in the course of creation. So end of quote. So that's very sobering. There's some sense in which God does not complete the act of creation, but he imparts the completion of the creation of the human person to other human agents. So the participation of the parents or the primary care, well, in this case it would be the parents, is not merely the contribution of the bodily dimension of the human person's being. There's actually a profound contribution to the spiritual creation of the self, and that's what I would like to look at here, and especially how it goes wrong. So when God creates the human person, you could say he creates us, in a sense, in the object dimension of our being. And he saw that it was good. That's what Genesis tells us. So he creates us as good. And what does it, I want to pause over that. What does it mean to say that something is good? It means that the thing has the right to exist. The being that is created is justified in its existence, that it's somehow worthy of existence. We don't need to do anything about this thing in order for it to have the right to exist. Simply because of what it is justified in existence. And we feel very, very deeply, primarily on the level of, you could say, the heart, that evil is the opposite. Whenever we encounter something evil, we say, it doesn't make sense that this should exist. What are we going to do about it? How is it going to be justified in the end? Right? That's the very deep metaphysical question that we experience from the earliest time of life. So evil is the thing that is not justified and requires to be put into a relationship with the good in order ultimately to be justified. Okay, so God creates us as objects and he creates us as good. But of course, as persons, we also exist as subjects. And this is what I would like to suggest. This is where I would like to suggest the contribution of the human parents comes in, or the primary caretakers. That our existence as subjects comes about through the creative power of the human parents' love. Now, when I say create, I mean that somewhat analogously, because of course the selfhood of the human person is already created by God. It's in place. But it has to unfold. Otherwise it remains dormant, or like a seed that hasn't developed. And we have an extreme case of this in the case of feral children. So feral children are those who are, for whatever reason, they find they're in the wild and they don't awaken as persons in the most extreme cases. Okay, so when God creates us, he creates us as good. Now, what about our subjectivity? How do we come into existence as subjects? I think there are three dimensions to this. First, there's a creation of my awareness of myself as a personal being. So that it doesn't go without saying. So if a human infant is born and grows, it doesn't go without saying that it will awaken to its own personhood. So from within, right? That's what subjectivity is to be aware of myself from within. And it doesn't go without saying that the human being will awaken to himself as a person. That requires human love. The second dimension is the creation of myself as an individual, unique, and irreplaceable being. Someone who is truly, in the strict sense, one of a kind. This is the second dimension of our awakening as subjects. The awareness from within of our own unique individuality. And the third dimension, I think, is absolutely inseparable from this second dimension, which is coming into an interior awareness of my own goodness, of my own worthiness to exist. I think that if I have a sense, if the human person has a sense of his own preciousness, then he also awakes up as an individual. It's going to be especially apparent to others. It becomes apparent to the person himself, I think, especially when we have that in crisis, when there's some kind of difficulty with respect to experiencing my own individuality. That's when I think our individuality makes itself felt from within most palpably, when it's in crisis. But there is a positive awareness of it that I'm going to talk about soon. So these are the three dimensions, you could say, of subjectivity, of that inner awareness of myself. So how does this work? How is it that I emerge to myself, that I awaken as a subject? So I cannot see myself any more directly, any more than I can see my own eyes. I think it's kind of nice that in English you have a homonym. You have I as the personal self, and you have the I, which is EYE. So the I, neither of these eyes can see themselves directly. In order to see your eyes, what do you have to do? You have to stand before a mirror, and your eyes have to be reflected back to yourself. So in the first instance of our emerging to ourselves as subjects, we have to be reflected to ourselves in the eye of another. So we have to be received by another. And of course, this is a deeply personal act. Mark spoke about this. It's not a neutral registering of our being, but it's the being received by another. And in the presence of that reception, we begin to awaken to ourselves as an I, as someone who is a subject and also has an interior. So, in very general terms, the parents, in a sense, and that here, I had a discussion yesterday at dinner with some of the people at my table about feminism and about the crisis of womanhood nowadays and of motherhood. If only mothers understood how important their role is. So it's that both parents, but especially the mother, looks at the child and in a sense says how good it is that you exist. How good it is that you exist. But not in an impersonal way, but you cause me to rejoice in your existence. And this rejoicing reflects back the preciousness of the child. So the opposite of this is to look at the child and say, you're very useful to me in your being. Or, why did you have to come to exist? Why did you have to come to exist just now? Do you see that? And you can see that in this case, perhaps the personhood of the self begins to emerge, but not a sense of individuality or a sense of one's preciousness. So as the child is seen, now let's go back to the positive way of being seen, where the child is given to him or herself as one who is precious and who ought to exist. The person begins to feel from within that he or she is justified in their existence. And I think this is one of the important meanings of self-love. I don't think it can be gained by a reflexive self-affirmation, although I do think that the right kind of psychology, and I have a long list of books that I think are very useful for this that I can give to you all later. But I don't think it's primarily a reflexive state of affirming myself as one who is good. It's a sense from within that it's good that I exist, which consists primarily, you could say, in the absence of feeling that I need to justify my existence. Do you see that? So I'd like to emphasize that. If everything goes as it should, this sense of the worthiness of my own existence positions me in a very positive way not to be focused on myself, but to be prepared to do what Mark talked about so beautifully, to make a gift of myself. So if you think about, again, the analogy of the eyes is very useful. Normally we see through the eyes and by the eyes, but are you aware of your eyes under normal circumstances? See that? We take in the world through the eyes, but we ought normally not experience or feel our eyes. When do we feel our eyes? When our eyeball is scratched or stings or we have something in it. And at that moment it becomes very difficult to look at the world and see the world. It's going to be an analogy also for how things go wrong with the self awakening to itself. So when the person precisely is not properly loved and affirmed, then the experience emerges that I am not justified in my own existence. I must do something to earn the right to exist. And this is the cliche of having low self-esteem. It's too bad that the real meaning of this has been lost and it's become sort of trivialized. But it's a very deeply existential experience. It's a sense that I don't have the right to exist just as who I am and what I am. I have to, in some sense, earn my existence. So this is very interesting. We don't have time to go into this, but This experience of myself as not being justified goes along with another experience. I think it's inseparable from it, which is a sense of also existence itself somehow not being safe and not being a good place. There's something relational here. Existence is threatening. Somehow I must keep myself safe in a context which is not welcoming. I have to leave that aside for now, but I think it's inseparable from this other experience. Okay, so what is the quality of this experience? Edith Stein has a lot of interesting things, I think, to say when she talks about moods, and she speaks of a total state of the soul. And I'm not saying that what I'm talking about here, this experience, is a mood in that precise sense, but it has a lot in common. So the experience of not being justified in my existence, I think, is primarily some sort of affective experience. So it's not a cognitive state. It's not something that I know conceptually or as an object that stands before the mind, but it's a kind of feeling that suffuses my interior being. And it's very deeply existential. So it has its origin in an experience that I have, which is, just to be very shorthand about it, it's not good that you exist. And as responsive to that experience, it contains that coloring, that affective coloring. It's not good that I exist. And it operates as the backdrop of our relationship to the world and to others. It's a kind of, as I say, Edith Stein's, I think, concept of the total state of the soul is very useful here. Okay, so what happens when this goes wrong? So I see I have 5 minutes. Okay, so there's a lot to say here. I'll just try to summarize this in very broad outlines. Now, the self has awakened as a person, but the self as an individual, as the one who has the right to exist, does not emerge under these circumstances. In some sense, there are dynamics that emerge that in some sense eclipse the true self to itself, but also to others. There are various, I would say, mechanisms that arise that are connected with this initial experience, existential experience of not being received in love. And here I'm just going to mention two. So the first has to do with, it's connected with the suffering that is experienced in the absence of affirmation. I think this is very mysterious. There must be some deep sense that I ought to be affirmed, and when the affirmation isn't received, there's a state of suffering that exists. Being, in a sense, rejected as one who is not worthy of existence gives rise to suffering within the soul. Now, that suffering is not resolved. People often say that children are resilient, and I want to say they are not resilient. They're very quick to forgive, and it's very easy to resolve things, but unless you could say the steps of resolution are taken, there is not a recovery from these very deep wounds. But what children are very good at doing is they're very good at coping with the suffering that is incurred in this early stage. Now, this has to do with the nature of suffering, and here all of this is, of course, kind of a philosophy of psychology, but it's based on very deep anthropological truths. The suffering is something which can't be borne. It's something which is inherently repellent. So if you think about, the Western movies that you watch where somebody's about to have an amputation and there's nothing to numb the pain, there's no anodyne, the person goes unconscious, right, when the pain gets great enough. And that's what the child does with respect to these deep existential pains around love. They go unconscious to it by use of these mechanisms. And this is what we don't have time for. Psychology, I think, has done a wonderful job of illuminating what these mechanisms are. But in some sense, what happens is, the way I put it is, you have now these, you could say, almost like the white blood cells coming to heal or to deal with the wound. You have various emotions that come into play to help the child to deal with the wound, to, in some sense, cover it or numb it. And there are all sorts of things. There can be resolutions that are made. Love isn't important anyway. I cannot trust anyone. or I have to do something to earn the right to exist. And I think of these as unresolved centers of emotions that crystallize and in some sense eclipse the self. They stand now as an interpretive overlay between the self and the world, which they experience initially as somehow hostile or unsafe. This acts as a very deep block between the self of the person and other selves. In some sense, two persons cannot connect authentically, as Edith Stein says. She writes about the need for authentic relations in order for a genuine community to exist. And she says the person can move from his authentic depth into superficial dimensions of his own being. And I think what happens here is we have something like that going on. The depth of the person is covered up by these mechanisms of defense. However, the suffering is still there underneath. And in some sense, it is still clamoring for relief. So that's the other thing that I think is going on. You have the suffering that is persisting and on a very deep level is looking for relief. So then just to tie things up, because my mandate today was to speak about the crisis, and tomorrow I'm going to be speaking about the resolution to this. So in this case, the other person then is, when I encounter others, if you think about being in pain, let's take something like a paper cut, okay? And let's pour lemon juice in it for good measure. Immediately, as soon as you experience the pain in there, what do? As a knee-jerk reaction, you put the finger up to your mouth and you try to assuage the pain. So there's something about suffering, unless we are take a distance from it and really remain awakened in conscience, the dynamism is to seek relief. And so I think what happens is, as the person emerges into, you could say, adulthood, rather than having a self, like the eyes that are free and clear and ready to relate to the world as it is in itself and being responsive to value, you have a state of, first of all, these interpretive overlays through which we see the world and can't access it clearly, and there's also the suffering that needs assuaging. And so the person that is hurt in this way tends to reach out towards others as ones who can somehow heal and salve those wounds. Again, if the person is not conscious. And so you could say there's a sort of subterranean movement within a very wounded culture, which forbids or makes very difficult that people relate to each other as, you could say, ends in themselves, as ones who are worthy of love just for who they are. But there's a kind of knee-jerk reaction of reaching out towards the other as one who can give me the love that I need. And of course, love is going to be the answer. But now we find ourselves in a situation where the demand far outstrips the supply. And it's very interesting to me when I read various blogs and sites that are trying to get at, you could say, what it is that our culture is really looking for. Everybody talks about the deep thirst for love and for being loved. Notice that. If you go on and look at the discussions around this, everybody's yearning to be loved. You don't see people speaking of, I'm yearning to love. Isn't that very interesting? Okay, so tomorrow I'm actually going to speak about what we can do about this. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Maria. Can I use this? Okay, can everybody hear me now? Very good, excellent. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Charles. My last book that I published was on the American jail. It was on personalism in the American jail. And while researching for that book, I had some very searing experiences at the Cook County Jail in Chicago. It's one of the biggest jails in America, and at that point it had about 11,000 inmates. And 3,000 of those inmates suffered from severe mental illness. And so encountering these people was a very powerful experience. And then I ended up as a volunteer teacher in a county jail for 4 years, where I once again experienced this crisis, we're speaking of crises here, of mental illness in our penal system. And so I thought maybe I would write another book on this topic. But sadly, as I spent more time with this population of people, I realized that I didn't have a lot of policy prescriptions. When you write books in ethics, people want to know, well, what are you going to do about it? And I realized that I didn't know what to do about it, and I still don't. What I'm going to share with you today is some ideas about how we might think about it, but I'm not sure that we really have any very clear policy ways of dealing with this terrible crisis. And so I want to start by talking about this word madness. Some of you might have been offended by it, but I want to indicate why I've used it. And then I want to talk about statistics. It's the major crisis we have in our penal system with mental illness or madness, and the ways we tried to deal with this in the last maybe 100 years, actually, and they have, many of them, completely failed. And lastly, I want to talk about the importance of not seeing this as primarily or only a biological problem. This has been a trend. And for this group and for myself, I think it's very important to begin with the idea of the person as an embodied spirit. That's a fundamental starting point. So this word madness, I use it because historians of mental illness or madness tend to use it. I gave you a selection from an excellent scholar named Andrew Scull. And the historians of madness say when you start off with this word mental illness, you're already endorsing a certain understanding, particularly a biological understanding, of a problem that's been in the human condition for really thousands of years. There have always been people who can't function very well, who disrupt, who can't do what their societies ask them to do, who hurt themselves, who hurt other kinds of people. But people look at this problem in many different ways. There's always been a tension. Is it primarily, going back to the Hippocratic tradition, is this primarily a biological problem? Is it a spiritual problem? Is it a mix of these two? Or maybe it's a social problem. Maybe most of us don't know how to deal with different kinds of peoples. Today we talk about neurodiversity, which may be a buzzword, but there's something to that, because many times we, as social beings, don't recognize that people are different and people operate in many different ways. So the historians of this issue prefer the word madness. Again, some people find that offensive, but I don't. I think it's a preferable term. I'm going to use the two interchangeably because we're so used to this term, mental illness. Now, what is the situation in our penal system? We have over 300,000 people with what is classified as severe mental illness. And this is schizophrenia, this is major depression, this is bipolar depression. And there are so many more who are not diagnosed. As I said, when I went into Cook County Jail, over 3,000 people were there, and they came in and out, in and out. They went out and disturbed people at Starbucks and were brought back into the Cook County Jail and back and forth. Extraordinary numbers of people. And these people do not fare well in a penal system. They don't follow rules. It's very difficult for them to follow rules. They don't get the medication they need, or they get the wrong medication, or they don't get any medication at all. And they are very disruptive often. They can be violent toward other people. They're often victimized because we have a special place in the prison where I volunteer, practically in the basement of the prison, for the people who cannot function and have been assaulted because of their mental illness. And so the situation is really horrible. In the state of Wisconsin, just about a month ago, this actually made the New York Times, we had a prison warden at one of our maximum security prisons indicted, and 8 other people indicted in 4 deaths of people suffering from severe mental illness. There's a high suicide rate. The situation is dire. And when you encounter this, it's deeply troubling and deeply moving. So this is a major crisis. And as someone who works in personalism, if you're comfortable with treating persons this way, some people are. They say, let's just put them away. They're not bothering us. I don't have to see that homeless person on the street ranting and raving. If you're comfortable with this kind of way of addressing our issue, then I'm going to have to talk more about the value and the dignity of the human person, because this is, in my view, not a way to treat persons. So the current system we have is not effective. It's not healing. Thomas Dart, who's the sheriff in Cook County, said to me one time, penal institutions are not places to heal from mental illness. This is just not the place to be. So the current system is not working. So what do people say about this? Well, some people say, well, we used to deal with this in a much better way. We used to have big mental institutions. We need to go back to the way things were after deinstitutionalization, which is a complex topic. But beginning in the late 50s, early 60s, we began to close these big mental institutions and try to find other ways of addressing this. But if you study the history of mental illness or madness, you find out just how horrible these places were. In 1955, we incarcerated over 500,000 Americans in state mental institutions. I mean, these were enormous places, New York State, California, Pennsylvania, and the conditions, particularly for people without money, were absolutely horrific. So it's one of the reasons we moved away from these places, in addition to the fact that this was very expensive, and states just no longer wanted to spend the money incarcerating those people. So I don't really see that as an option. Someone might, but to me that's just another prison, another form of incarceration. Now in the early 70s, we had this idea of community care. We're going to move people out of the big institutions. We're going to deal with smaller kinds of housing. And in some sense, that was a good policy, but we didn't pay for it. And it really failed. We moved some of our elderly populations into nursing homes, which was a positive thing. But a lot of people ended up in the street, ended up in what are called SROs in New York City, wandering around, not getting medication, not getting any kind of help. We really didn't want to pay the money that we needed in order to try to make this work. And then there's the problem of NIMBYism, not in my backyard. My wife is in politics in Green Bay and encounters this problem all the time. We don't want these people in our neighborhood. Keep them away over and over and over again, particularly in local politics. We had a debate about veterans with PTSD, and everyone said, yeah, we love the veterans, but we don't want them in our neighborhood. So that approach didn't really address the problem at all. And so as I've said, I'm not really sure what to do. It's kind of embarrassing. If you write in ethics, you're supposed to tell people how to live, but I'm not really sure how to approach this. However, I do know that there's certain ways of looking at it that I think are not advisable. Psychiatry and psychology over the last, really since the late 80s, 1990s, moved more and more in terms of a biological model, pharmacology particularly. And so people they see their depression as primarily a problem of the brain or something else. And we've retreated to the use of pharmacological devices. And the record there isn't very good either, unfortunately. It hasn't ADHD medications for young people, all kinds of things like that. But the model, and this is not a controversial statement, the model is primarily a biological one with the use of neuroscience. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm not opposed to neuroscience, beautiful field, not opposed to pharmacology, not opposed to those approaches at all. So I need to make that clear because sometimes when I speak, people accuse me of being anti-science or anti-progress or something like that. Not at all. But we have to look at that in terms of a larger understanding of the human person. And to me, we need to emphasize that the human person is an embodied spirit. There's a spiritual component to us, and there's a bodily component to us. Obviously, philosophically, this is a complex matter, and I hope during this week we'll get a larger picture of what it means to be an embodied spirit. But all of these illnesses have strong biological components, neuroscientific components, but also spiritual dimensions, and we need to approach it from that standpoint. And so this isn't a magic elixir. This is not a special silver bullet. I'm telling you that once we do that, we're going to be able to do all kinds of other things. What I am convinced of is the purely biological model is mistaken. Okay. Now, I want to end here by indicating I appreciated Professor Spencer's presentation. I largely endorse the vision that he presented to us. But my work for the last maybe 40 years has been, okay, we endorse that view. How do we make it function in a world of violence and coercion and power and brokenness? And so my research plus my personal experience with institutions, which I'll talk about a little bit more in this conference, really focuses on that, because it's not easy. It's not easy to know what to do with a person who is covered in feces or screaming or something like that, and how to be present to that person in a meaningful way. And the same thing applies to military experiences and all kinds of things. So as I said, I'm going to say a bit more about this later in the conference, but this personalism that we study here has a very distinctive vision of what a person is. I think this is something we really need to emphasize, not shy away from, but bring out into the open and defend. And that's something that I'm very strongly committed to. All right, so thank you, and I'd welcome some comments and some questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all three of our speakers. We have about 5 minutes for questions. So I assume there's a microphone somewhere that can be run around. Christopher has one back there. So raise your hand. Keep the question as brief as you can, please, so we can get as many in the next 5 minutes. Just shout.
I'll bring you one that works.
Dr. Fedoryka, I have a question for you. Thank you all for your very interesting presentations. Okay, this is good. I have a question about what is the difference between receptivity and reflection, specifically referring to Hildebrand's comment that love and intimacy is kind of communicated through those interpenetrating looks. And one of the things that I thought as you were talking was between two people, when one is receptive to the other's love, there's absorption that happens. And some might say that they're communicating their receptivity to someone else by sharing themselves back. And I think where I'm struggling with the receptivity versus reflection is that how does the one who is being loved know or become affirmed in what that they've given is worthwhile when they're not really being like complimented per se? Like I think I could view someone as saying, oh, I don't need to compliment you because I'm just sharing myself back. But I think that there's something missed there. There's like a receptivity but not reflection of the other. And I was hoping you could comment on that. But it's okay.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, no, it's okay.
So you're talking about the person who's doing the reflecting back of the other person as precious to himself?
Yes.
You mean by the reflection, and then the receptivity is the one who is being given to himself through being instant? And you're saying what is the difference between those, or how are they supposed to
Yes, like how is the good of the person reflected back to them? And in the interpenetrating looks, it's almost as if your good is being reflected back because I'm giving you myself, not that I'm telling you how you are good.
Okay. Oh gosh, I think I would probably need to hear a little bit more about your question to understand. I mean, yeah, I think I just didn't understand enough. I'm so sorry. I mean, Edith Stein writes about the way in which the presence of two people to one another occurs not only spiritually, but in and through the body. So if you're talking about that kind of the causality, what is it that communicates? It's going to be ultimately in and through the body. But as for the rest, I think maybe we can talk afterwards. Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
Let's take one more.
Thank you, all three of you. Dr. Jeffries' question, have there been models in history that you're aware of where the problem of madness and of treating persons or caring for them has worked better than in other models?
Well, we have to ask what works means. But yes, people have been addressing the medieval period, historians of madness have been exploring this. Obviously, they didn't have the biological understanding that we have, and I think that is a kind of progress. But there are also different ways of accepting people with, we don't want to be romantic about this. Michel Foucault, I think, is a bit romantic about the history of madness. Many times people were just locked up in basements and things like that. There are also different social ways of understanding this kind of illness. You think about the history of epilepsy or things like that, that we're perhaps more accepting. And we tend to lock people up. We tend to put them away. We tend to complain about the fact that we don't have more resources and that get this perfect person off the street and put them in the jail. That's a fairly modern approach. The jail and the prison are maybe really 500 years old in terms of the primary way of dealing with social problems. And so I'm not going to romanticize the past in any way. I wouldn't want to be treated by a medieval physician, have leeches and things of that nature. But I also want to recognize that socially, politically, religiously, maybe some people in the past understood madness in some ways that were better than we do.
All right, let's thank our speakers.